OG Rose, and today we're going to continue reading from Belonging Again II.1, and we've really appreciated the support so far. And feel free to ask any questions, anything in the chat. We're happy to do that. Last time we read through the introduction, and today we're going to be reading through chapter 1, 1A, probably to about 1D, which is going to be on Plato's allegory of the cave. And please also note I had a wonderful discussion with Cadell last that premiered today on the class starting with the philosophy of right. That will be starting on the 18th of this month, and please do check that out. It's going to be a wonderful class, and we highly, highly suggest it. And so what we're going to be doing today is continue to read through the text. Please, like I said, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to ask. Always happy to entertain. Like I said, I'll be reading, so I'll do my best to keep up with the chat. But like I said, thank you for joining. So this is going to be called, the first section is Comparing Translations of the Allegory. Memory is a funny thing, prone to change with use. Details fade, episodes arise, which never happened, and gaps appear wholesale. We never remember everything. We'd go crazy if we did, but we like to think we remember what matters, and most of the time we do, or at least we maintain enough of the general picture to get the gist. For everyday life, this is fine, but something funny happens with books, especially great books. In complex texts like Plato, forgetting a single detail can transform the meaning and impression of entire sections, and if memory is shaped by the spirit of our age, details we tend to forget or remember will likely be relative to and reflect that zeitgeist. When it comes to Plato's most famous allegory, I think something like this has happened. Plato's allegory of the cave is likely his most influential scene, inspiring countless movies and stories. The Matrix comes to mind, in which the protagonist Neo discovers he is inside a computer simulation and works to break free and defeat the robots controlling humanity. The key detail I want to focus on is how Neo freely chooses to learn the truth about his world, the difference between the shadows and the actual sun per se, by choosing the red pill, now a famous meme. Yes, Neo was given the opportunity by his guide Morpheus, but ultimately Neo chooses the pill himself. Personally, I'd wager this is generally how most of us remembers Plato's allegory. A prisoner somehow escapes his chains and chooses to ascend to the true world. Maybe the prisoner is freed by a guard or teacher and told the truth about the shadows of the cave, but the ultimate choice is left to the prisoner. A rugged individual, brave and independent, the prisoner suffers the pain of his eyes, adjusting to the sun, and perses through. Heroic Buddha, John Galt, countless supermen come to mind. The cave came up in a discussion with the wonderful Thomas Jockin, episode 40, OG Rose Conversation, and I tried to remember how exactly the prisoner was first nudged to leave the world of shadows and ascend into the world of forms. I personally fumbled around, noting that the allegory seemed to suggest that the prisoner was just somehow mysteriously released, but I wasn't sure. We both agreed that Plato didn't adequately address this question, that a first mover problem lurked, and this got us into the subject of beauty and its primacy in being a first mover in the realization of the Trinitarian and necessary good, true, and beautiful. Still, I left the conversation with an open loop in my mind. What exactly did Plato say about how the prisoner escaped the cave? Why was my memory blurring together vague scenarios? There's nothing like returning to a primary text to make me realize how bad I am at reading. Returning to Plato, countless details I forgot appeared salient, and every word seemed to carry a new weight. I've read the Republic numerous times, but also hardly at all. Books are like people, there's always more. I checked 3 translations of the Republic, one by Grube, Grube, another by Jowett, Jowett, and lastly, Alan Bloom. Not that these are necessarily the best translations, they were just the ones I had available, and the verdict seemed clear. The prisoner did not act alone. Nowhere did the prisoner free himself or choose to ascend out of the cave without prompting. So why did I recall the story as a narrative of individual enlightenment and self-ascent? Sure, I knew the allegory involved education and learning the truth, but the imagery and movie in my head of the allegory was one of chosen and autonomous ascent. I didn't recall the prisoner being dragged out as the explanation of how he escaped. What was going on? It's clear I had been influenced by my culture to forget the details that didn't fit into Western thinking, emphasizing the individual, but I also discovered that different translations created different Impressions, yes, all of them incorporated the prisoner being forced out of the cave, but the presentation shifted in profound ways. Again, I checked different translations and started to understand what happened. Moving forward, I'm going to discuss the free interpretation versus the dragged interpretation, with the first referring to an understanding of the prisoner leaving on his or her own, while the second is the reading of the prisoner as forced to leave the cave. I'll refer to these as FI and DI for short. Also, as a grammar note, direct quotations will be in single apostrophes, while my takes will be in double apostrophes, a style I use throughout all my books. So again, I had a conversation with Thomas Jock, and we were wondering how exactly did the prisoner leave the cave. And so we went back and, read the Republic, and it turned out that the prisoner was always dragged out, which was interesting because you kind of remember the allegory as the prisoner just leaves on his own or his or her own. There's a certain enlightenment that comes with it. But it turns out that that's not really the case of what occurred. And then the question, of course, is, why did memory go in that direction? So starting the next section, I've always liked Orson Welles. And I have to give his reading of Plato credit, which is easily found on YouTube. It clearly displays the dragged interpretation. The TED Talk version by Alex Gendler, Gendler, is okay. It's all right, but the drag detail is raced over quickly. And visually, it's more like the prisoner just appears outside with the narrator, mentioning how the prisoner was freed and brought outside. To be more precise, Gendler says, suddenly one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time, which is fine when we're focusing on the force detail, but that wording could easily support the prisoner possibly freed himself and then was escorted to the service and or brought himself outside. And we likely will hear the sentence as suggesting such if that's what we want to hear or have been taught to think. There are countless more versions of the allegory, and I will not note that in many of them which mention dragging, the dragging is presented like a hypothetical situation, which is to say that we're supposed to consider what if the prisoner was dragged out, not that this actually happened. The impression that we're given space to let ourselves entertain is that really the prisoner escaped autonomously, and based on the translation, I think it's easy to read the rest of the allegory that way, as the escaped prisoner embarking on his own journey of education and recognition that needs to return to the cave to help the remaining prisoners, even though they may kill him. In truth, Plato isn't so generous. For him, it seems without force, we stay ignorant. Based on the translation, how we might understand the part of the cave involving force varies radically. For sometimes it seems like a hypothetical situation, while other times it seems concrete. And of course, it all depends on who we read, and ultimately it seems like Plato wants to play both sides, but more on that later. The allegory appears at the start of Book 7 in the Republic, and here is the opening according to 3 different translations. We will start with Grub, and up, Psycho Club, it is good to see you. I hope you are well. So next, I said, compare the effects of education and of lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. And that would be 186 of Grub. And Miles, good to see you. Thanks for coming by. So in Grub's translation, the fact the allegory is about education is clear. The phrase, the effect of education, leans in the direction of schooling and instruction, though not necessarily, admittedly, especially if the FI is strongly lodged in our minds. But now let's turn to the Joet interpretation, which is on page 224. And now, I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground den. So that's the same section, but a different translation. And, this easily could have nothing to do with school or external educators. This easily falls into thinking regarding autonomy and self-found enlightenment. In Joet, the allegory which follows isn't clearly situated within an educational framework involving help from teachers or others. The allegory is left open to be understood as favoring autonomous individuals. Bloom is similar. Next, then, make an image of our nature in its education and want of education, likening it to a condition of the following kind. See human beings as though they were in an underground cave-like dwelling. So this is Alan Bloom's translation. I think this translation, this is me, is a toss-up. The phrase, our nature in its education, is not clearly suggesting we need to be educated by someone. The word education here could be taken as enlightenment, which suggests FI, and by FI we mean the free interpretation. Out of the three translations, in my view, but it is the group translation that frames the allegory most clearly as about school and instructions. Yes, the Bloom and Jowett interpretations will make up for this impression later on in different ways, but first impressions are important and set the stage. Moving on, in Grube's translation, the first main image of a released prisoner we get is, so this is 187 of the Grube translation, when one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk, and look up toward the light, he'd be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before. What do you think he'd say if we told him that what he'd seen before was inconsequential? So, me speaking now, a prisoner was freed and compelled. This sounds like someone was involved in helping the prisoner escape, but maybe not. So this is important. Influenced by FI, the language of was freed could be taken as meaning freed ourselves, and the word compelled could be taken as inspired. A we is introduced in the next sentence, but the we doesn't necessarily have to be taken as a teacher or prison guard. In fact, the language of we sounds like, what if we were there in the cave and told the prisoner the truth? Thus, though Grube's interpretation opens with the best framing, this image of release isn't clearly aligned with external instruction. In the Grube interpretation, Miles, G-R-U-E-B-E. And I'm moving between three different ones, so I appreciate y'all listening. So the question we're asking is, why exactly did I remember the prisoner leaving the cave on his or her own, not being dragged? Because actually, in the allegory, the prisoner is dragged out, which is funny because it's so easy to forget that detail or remember it as a hypothetical when really it's quite primary for Plato, which suggests that there's a question of how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own that has not been fully thought or addressed, possibly at the very basis of Western thought. All right, resuming. All right, let's turn to Jowett, which, do note, is the Barnes & Noble translation, widely distributed and read. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck around and walk and look toward the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which in his former state he had seen the shadows, and then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before him was an illusion. This is page 225. Everything I said about Grube applies here, but more so, the Jowett interpretation is very autonomous sounding and favors FI over DI. Yes, the phrase when one of them is liberated could be taken to mean when someone releases them, but that's not clearly the case, and the prisoner easily could liberate his or herself. Again, the language of compelled also sounds self-motivated. So that word compelled is interesting because it can sound, forced out, but it can also mean inspired, depending on the zeitgeist in which you are reading the allegory. Finally, we move to Bloom. Take a man who is released and suddenly compelled to stand up, to turn his neck round, to walk and look up toward the light, and who, moreover, in doing all this in pain, and because he is dazzled, is unable to make out those things whose shadows we saw before. What do you suppose he'd say if someone were to tell him that before he saw silly nothings? That's 194 Bloom. So despite Bloom's original unclear framing, this I think is most likely to favor DI over FI. The phrase is released sounds like a guard frees the prisoner and then makes him stand up and look up toward the light. The term someone then easily points back to that guard, who could also be a teacher, which makes the instruction about silly nothing seem more concrete versus hypothetical. But please note, not necessarily. It could still take a man who is released, so he's just freed, and suddenly compelled. So maybe he's freed and then he's inspired himself to go, right? So all these kind of details can mix together. But all right, let's resume. We're now at the main section for our investigation. Let's start with Grube and Bloom this time, for their translations are identical. And if someone dragged him away from there by force, that's Grube, page 188. Okay, and this is Bloom, 194. And if someone dragged him away from there by force, both of them entail, though, here's the trick, both of them entail a pesky if, which leans us in a direction of considering the use of force as hypothetical. But this leaning is also notably influenced by what we read before. This line in the context of Bloom's translation can favor DI, but Grube has primed us with language of we, hypothetical sounding, and the unclear was freed, neither of which clearly favor DI over FI. Considering this, neither translations may prove strong enough to shatter my preconceived ideas we bring to the text from our Western culture. FI will likely prevail. We are very likely to project into this a free interpretation of a prisoner leaving their own. Funny enough, it's actually here where the Joet interpretation favors DI over FI. And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent. So here Joet, I think, has the clearest DI interpretation, because it says reluctantly dragged up. And so there's this notion of not wanting to go and you're forced. So that's quite powerful versus, theoretically, you could be dragged and not mind being dragged, which the Grube and the Bloom interpretations leave open. But in Joet, when we say reluctantly dragged, it's quite clear that you have to be forced out. Now, of course, by now with Joet, we might have been so primed to think in FI that we don't see the DI going on here. And of course, additionally, suppose once more can sound hypothetical, like the mentioned we. But I think in the context of Socrates speaking to Glaucon, the phrase suppose once more sounds more like Glaucon, keep following me here. And suppose once more actually comes off as less hypothetical sounding compared to and if used in the other two translations. But that might just be my opinion. The translations all make different impressions in different ways. And if we consider the dragging as a hypothetical dragging, then it's easy for us to imagine the prisoner as actually leaving on his or her own, which is to say there is space for FI. Culturally conditioned, that's exactly where I think our minds venture. That said, I'm not entirely against considering the FI, because I think Plato does ultimately leave hanging a question, what I call here the first prisoner problem and or the prisoner nobody comes for. But this will be discussed later. Considering this and framing the Joet interpretation as most in favor of FI, I don't mean to necessarily suggest that Joet is the worst translation at all, for it could be the most faithful in translation. All I mean to say is that in my own personal assessment, Joet is easiest to read in line with FI, for good and for bad. That's not necessarily for bad, because the free interpretation has to be taken quite seriously. The question we are asking is not a moral judgment of interpretations, but how is it that it has seemingly been the case that this notion of the first prisoner problem has been forgotten or overlooked or not noted? And we're going through the translations to make that case. Section 1.1c is really going to be going more and more into details. And that, so here we'll resume here. I would like to investigate another reason why the FI interpretation is so easy to fall into, a reason involving the attitude of the other prisoners. Those who don't leave the cave are described as being people who would murder someone who tried to release them. Well, if that's the case, even if the prisoner who ascended was released by someone else, the fact the released prisoner didn't murder the guard or teacher who released him means the released prisoner must be different somehow. On the passage in question, considering the three translations, and I think, like, what I mean by that is, when the prisoner eventually comes back to the cave, we're told that the prisoners who are still there want to murder the prisoner. So if this prisoner, even if we do have this idea that someone comes and pulls the prisoner out, the very fact that that prisoner who's pulled out doesn't murder the person who comes for them suggests there's something different. So there's something different about them that thus kind of favors an autonomy. And I think that's fair, Mills. I think that's a good point. On the Grube, we'll start with Grube. And as for anyone who tried to free them and led them upward, if they could somehow get their hands on them, wouldn't they kill him? So Joet, men would say of him that up he went and down he came without his eyes, and that it was better not even to think of ascending. And if anyone tried to loose another and lead him up to the light, then let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. And then going to Bloom, and if they were somehow able to get their hands on and kill the man who attempts to release and lead up, wouldn't they kill him? So all of them are suggesting that if anyone tries to free the prisoners, they're killed. So if the prisoner was dragged but didn't kill the person who tried to drag them, that means that prisoner must be different somehow, right? So the autonomy, the individualism comes in there. And indeed, that's not necessarily bad. There easily could be something different. But again, that favors a free interpretation versus a dragged interpretation, concealing the dragged interpretation. Resuming, Plato describes the prisoners as seeking to kill those who try to release them, which suggests that the prisoner who was willing to ascend was somehow different before he was released, an understanding which favors FI. Even if the freed prisoner resists leaving to some degree, he doesn't resist so much that he can't be brought out of the cave, suggesting he is still somehow special. Now, That considered, the counter to this point is that the remaining prisoners only want to kill the prisoner who escaped because he is unable to see clearly in the dark, creating the impression that going up is a bad and foolish act. Hence, now the remaining prisoners will kill anyone who tries to release them, but not necessarily before they receive this false impression about the upper world. So that would be a counter. I think this is a fair point, but I would first note that the plausibility of this understanding is dependent on the translation. Here, Jouet's interpretation actually seems to favor the proposed counter, for by the clause being divided by semicolons, the ideas seem to be linked together. In Bloom and Grube, however, the accusations of the remaining prisoners that the released prisoner got stupider by ascending is more easily separated from the idea that the remaining prisoners would kill anyone who tried to release them. However, Jouet has already established an impression favoring Fi, and it is unlikely this section of the allegory will change that impression this far into the narrative. Bloom and Grube, which can be read more in line with DI, ostensibly offer evidence which favoring Fi, evidence we in the West might be biased to overemphasize. If we as readers remember the remaining prisoners in the allegory as so bent on staying in the cave that they are willing to kill anyone who tries to free them, it's hard not to remember the escaping prisoner as somehow different and more willing to learn the truth than those who stay underground, even if the escaping prisoner was somehow helped. The very fact he was willing to ascend makes him somehow different. This feeds Fi over Di, and it's easy for us to read the rest of Book 7 as describing an education program that the philosophers are willing to receive versus an education program that drags them out of the cave, per se. Under Di, it's clear that Plato's education program is how prisoners are dragged out, but under Fi, we can read the program as that which special students submit themselves to following. This is key. Under Fi, we see philosophers as choosing to be educated and open to education. We do not see the education as a form of dragging. Thus, Fi is supported and maintained. After the allegory, the majority of Book 7 is an elaboration on how philosophers should be educated how should be educated to in fact become philosopher kings. And though this might seem to obviously favor the dragged interpretation, I would submit that this is not so obvious if we are reading from an orientation of Fi. While Plato is easily sketching out the education which leads people out of the cave, we can actually interpret the educational program as what philosophers choose to be led by, giving credit to the philosophers themselves. Plato's program becomes something that philosophers choose to submit themselves to, and thus they act to some degree autonomously. After all, under Fi, they were willing to be released from the cave, while the others would murder whoever tried to liberate them. Plato describes education not as self-driven, but as far more imposed on the self. But it is easy under Fi to read the program Plato describes after the allegory as the product of a self-driven education. In other words, we can think of Plato describing the education philosophers go through who are already unique before they are released. We carry the impression that the released prisoner was different in being willing to go outside, even if helped, and so we envision the student-teacher relationship in school similarly. Somehow, in our minds, we make sure to think of the philosophical student as innately special, not merely made such by an instructor like the DI would have us conclude. Whichever way we go about making Fi fit, we assume the best students are not only such thanks to instructions. We cling to some fragment of intrinsic specialness that Plato may not grant us. Yes, he might believe everyone has the capacity to learn, but that could be about it. To see how Plato puts it, we'll start with Grube. But our present discussion, on the other hand, shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from darkness to light without turning the whole body. Education takes for granted the sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look, and it tries to redirect it appropriately. Whereas our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning, so this is the Jouet interpretation, whereas our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already, and that just as the eye was unable to turn from darkness to light without the whole body, so too the instrument of knowledge can only by the movement of the whole soul be turned from the world of becoming into that of being, and learn by degree to endure the sight of being, and of the brightest and best of being, or in other words, of the good. And this is Bloom. But the present argument, on the other hand, indicates that the power is in the soul of each. And I think we can also hear, there is in Plato the notion of minnow, with remembering. There is math that if even the slave can remember something. So there's definitely in Plato a notion that the soul can contain what it needs to kind of see the forms, that it can remember different things. The question is, can an individual remember the forms on their own? Can they, or do they need to be dragged, right? And, it seems quite clear that in Plato it's a bit of both, or there's possibly both. But then if it is both, then there is a complicated relation we need to think that perhaps we have not thought that could have ramifications for education. And it also is interesting. I think it's in book 7 where it talks about all education should basically start with play and wonder. And if you don't do that, you make kids hate learning, which is a real problem. And I think in Upcycle and Miles, I appreciate you with your comments. I think that the prisoner being dragged out of this thoughtlessness describes both the release and the transition from a lack of awareness to awareness of the light. I think that's true. That's correct. There is this kind of movement from awareness. So thank you, Upcycle Club, because there is this kind of idea. But then the question that's interesting there is, why wasn't the prisoner who was dragged murder the person who tried to drag them? What is it that they sensed that made them not do that? Or maybe they did want to murder the person dragging them, but they weren't able to, et cetera, et cetera. So there are interesting questions here on the quality and nature of the prisoner who is dragged that seems to be open to receiving something from the person dragging them, but nevertheless must be dragged or not. These are the things we have to think. I'll resume here with the Bloom translation. But the present argument, on the other hand, indicates that the power is in the soul of each, and that the instrument with which each learns, just as an eye is not able to turn toward the light from the dark without the whole body, must be turned around from that which is coming into being together with the whole soul, until it is able to endure looking at that which is and the brightest part of that which is. And we affirm that this is the good, don't we? And that makes me think of Studebaker's lecture at Theory Underground. This is me speaking now. Please note that this section suggests prisoners have innate capacities to learn, which we, according to FI, can interpret as meaning innate motivation. But really, Plato seems to be suggesting that everyone can be dragged out of the cave following DI, or inspired out of the cave. So there's something that they experience that can pull them out. Everyone can be educated is not the same as everyone is capable of intrinsic motivation, though those who escape the cave may like to think this way, for it means they had no innate or unfair advantages, a Western bias. Perhaps. If everyone could leave the cave, then those who don't are responsible for not leaving, which actually suggests that prisoners who escape are justified not to return to the cave and try to set the remaining prisoners free. That should be noted. While Plato suggests the founders are justified to force philosophers back into the cave, especially under DI. With a strong FI, the reverse is the case. Prisoners are justified to stay above ground. That's not to say FI claims prisoners should stay above ground, but it certainly frames any kind of return as an act of sacrifice, which personally I think is a good framing, for DI can, if we're not careful, lead to totalitarianism. Also of note, Plato himself may contribute to the confusion about FI versus DI, for he seems to be playing both sides a little bit. He seems to be saying that we are forced out of the cave, but then other times suggests we bring ourselves out, perhaps because Plato himself might not have an answer to the hanging question of the first prisoner. I am not sure. He may also want to ignore that dilemma because of how it may threaten the justification of state action. If prisoners can leave on their own, then it wouldn't be so just to force them back into the cave, is what is suggested there. Now, again, that's not to say Plato doesn't have a reply to that. That's a larger question, but to resume. Now, I want to stress the word seems when I say Plato seems to be playing both sides of the fence, because I think it's clear that Plato himself thinks the founders are responsible for the education of philosopher kings, and thus the philosopher kings aren't self-taught, meaning the founders are justified to make them return into the cave. The seemingness noted above varies based on the translations, but in my opinion, our Western zeitgeist makes it relatively easy to interpret many and maybe even most translations in favor of the FI over the DI. Now, once the difference between FI and DI is pointed out, it becomes more obvious certain passages are saying the prisoners aren't intrinsically motivated, but I submit to you that such is not obvious when reading the passages from our Western bias, without at least any stress on DI. Reading through book 7, I can't think of any sections that struck me as easily disproving the FI in favor of the DI, for those who were already biased in favor of FI, helping explain why DI is so forsaken by people such as myself, referencing the conversation with Thomas Jockin. To return to the issue of how Plato may play both sides, Plato says when explaining the meaning of his allegory, so this is the Grove interpretation, the visible realm should be likened to the prisoner dwelling in the light of the fire inside it to the power of the sun. And if you interpret the upward journey in the study of things above as the upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm, and then this is the Joet, the prisoner house is the world of sight, the light of the fire is the sun, and you will not misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upward to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world. Bloom, 196. Liken the domain revealed through sight to the prisoner home and the light of the fire in it to the sun's power, and applying the going up and the seeing of what's above to the soul's journey up to the intellectual place. There was no journey, though, no ascent or going up. In Plato's allegory, the prisoner was dragged. All versions of what Plato says here favor Fi over Di, and frankly can contribute to reading back into the allegory a take on the described force in dragging, which is hypothetical in nature. If the allegory wasn't about an ascent of the soul, as Plato tells us, then we can wonder if perhaps the supposed teacher or guard who freed us was really someone inside of us, or some voice of truth who stirred us awake. And I think I saw Upcycle say something about a muse. Yes, that's exactly a possible take here. Really someone inside or some voice. None of this necessarily follows, and the language of journey and ascent can be overlaid with imagery of dragging, but please note how easily such interpretations align with Fi over Di, which again is not necessarily bad. And please note, if this is an educational program, in the one dragging us out is the muse, or we're going to talk about with Nietzsche the capital W will with Schopenhauer in the section that gets into beastocentrism. Well, then the question is, how do we make the cave incubate the muse within? Like, what would be the design of the medium condition, as the book will talk about, that will make the cave be a place of incubating the muse, right? So if the muse is what drags us out versus, say, a teacher, it's sort of an internal force, which would align with Meno and remembering, then the question becomes, how do we incubate that? So there is something here, like Sloterdijk talks about how genius and the placenta and parts of bubbles, how we need to think of human life as always double. It's double. And so here, if we're thinking of that there's always this Damien that is actually dragging us out, then the question is, how do we cultivate that? So that's exactly what we can take that to mean, that the dragging is actually the muse and interpretations, or the will. And then actually with Nietzsche on this idea that Plato's cave is actually all of us. We're all a Plato's cave. And the will, capital W, that needs to be dragged out is what we need to be dragged out of ourselves, which we can think of as as kind of an inspirational structure. So I think that's exactly right. That's a way to take it. And I appreciate the comments. In Plato describing the cave as an ascent of the soul or journey, Plato makes it sound like we walk out of the cave. In this way, Plato himself might contribute to the emergence of Fi, but he also moves back into Di. We won't be doing an injustice to those who've become philosophers in our city, and what grows out of its own accord and owes no debt for its upbringing has justice on its side when it isn't keen to pay anyone for that upbringing. And we go through the other one, and then Parsons, it's good to see you, sir. Now, what's very interesting is if there's an idea that somehow the philosophers are responsible for dragging out the prisoners, and thus there's justice on their side to put the prisoners back in, then it would be necessary for the philosophers to actually design the cave to incubate the muse within, to inspire prisoners to leave. And if they are so responsible, then they would be just to push the prisoners back in. But if the prisoners leave on their own by a muse, it is interesting to think, if a muse is what inspires the prisoners to leave, do the philosophers have justice on their side to push the prisoners back in? Because they could say, well, they only left because of a muse that wasn't their own autonomy. Therefore, it's not unjust to push them back in. Justice is clearly on their side if they pull them out, like they literally go in and pull them out, because they can say, well, you would have never left without us. But it is interesting to think if that shifts when you start talking about inspiration, and then who owns inspiration? Who owns the sources of inspiration? And that gets into interesting questions of justice that have to be thought through when we get to things like education in the classroom and so on and so forth. I'll skip ahead a little bit here. Plato is talking about the need to force philosophers to participate in civil life. So it's not Fi supporting here. We can see Plato is not necessarily saying that the prisoners escaped on their own, but that impression depends strongly on the translation. In fact, Plato suggests the prisoners aren't intrinsically motivated at all, and that thus they escape thanks to the founders, who are thus justified to force them back into the cave, as we were just saying. So this is key here, this section. I'll read Grube on page 192. John, good to see you, sir. And what grows, so this is the Grube translation. And what grows of its own accord and owes no debt for its upbringing has justice on its side when it isn't keen to pay anyone for that upbringing. So what it's saying here is that if you intrinsically left the cave, you left the cave on its own, then you have no debt to return to the cave. But if you were pulled out on your own, well, then, it's not an injustice to put you back in. So this is when he says the key line. But we've made you kings in our city and leaders of the swarm, as it were, both for yourselves and for the rest of the city. You're better and more completely educated than the others and are better able to share in both types of life. And this is where I think the interpretation of the will being what pulls you, the muse pulling out of the cave is very good. And that's definitely what we're going to follow when we get to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But it's also interesting that here, the moment the philosophers talk about having justice to push the prisoner back inside, that doesn't sound like a muse relationship. That sounds like they literally went down, pulled them out, and pushed them back in. Unless Socrates speaking here is the muse, or they somehow are able to create inspiration. And I think you could make that argument. You could make that argument going to the end of book 7, talking about how they facilitate wonder. I think they start with wonder, play, then they do athletics as a teenager. And they really don't introduce math and literature and all that until they're like 12 or something, which is very different from how we do education today. And Plato would, Plato would look at us as like, well, duh, that's why everyone hates school, because you introduce subjects way too early. Like you have to start with wonder. Like, before I start, a way to put this very quickly, before I start trying to tell you the facts of what compose a tree, and thank you, John, I appreciate it. It means a lot. And before I try to convince you of the composition of a tree, I need to make you fall in love with a tree. Like when you look at a tree, like the wonder, the strike of beauty, the raw experience of a tree, we go, wow, that's a tree and that's amazing. Then suddenly, I can start telling you about the facts and you will care because you've started in wonder. And so what Socrates warns is be careful to introduce anyone to a subject that they don't feel awe before or wonder before. And because then they're going to hate it. But if you make them fall in love with it, then you can introduce all the facts you want, and that becomes facts become substance per se, food for that wonder and inspiration. But you must start in wonder. And that's a wonderful point on memory. And that makes me think of Bergson there, where memory is kind of the critical basis of all metaphysics. And then, of course, recognition that Plato will get at Socrates and Meno, and then Augustine and Confessions, book 11 or something, when he gets to time. So to resume here, once our focus is drawn to the detail that we are dragged out of the cave, it's clear that the phrase, but we've made you kings in our city, means we brought you out of the cave, as it's also easy to understand the sentence, you're better and more completely educated, as meaning we founders better and more completely educated you. But I would argue that this section, which clearly can be understood as favoring DI, doesn't force us to accept DI if we are captured strongly by the zeitgeist of FI, which I would argue most of us are, especially in the West. Habituated to FI, the phrase, but we've made you kings, could just mean the philosophers who came out of the cave on their own were made kings. And because they were made kings, they owed the society. So what I mean by this is it could have been you left the cave on your own, and then after leaving the cave, you were made a king. And because you were made a king by the philosophers, you owe them now. But it wouldn't necessarily follow that the philosophers pulled you out of the cave. You could have left yourself and then were made kings. And I think that's a possible interpretation, especially when you're under a certain zeitgeist. And then, and again, looking at the Duet and Bloom, being self-taught. So this is the key, going back to that interpretation, that section of the Republic. Being self-taught, they cannot be expected to show any gratitude for a culture which they have never received. But we have brought you into the world to be rulers. So self-taught. So if you were self-motivated or self-taught, it would be unjust for you to be forced to do anything. But if you were not self-taught, then it's not an injustice. And then this is the Bloom interpretation. For they grow up spontaneously against the will of the regime in each. And a nature that grows by itself and doesn't owe its rearing to anyone has justice on its side when it is not eager to pay off the price of rearing to anyone. But you we have begotten for yourselves and for the rest of the city like leaders and kings and hives. You have been better and more perfectly educated. and are more able to participate in both lives. I will note here, isn't it wild how different translations can be? Like, I think it really is. It makes me think of Paul Ricoeur's book on translation. And, you really do see how big of a deal translation is when you take the same passage and kind of drop from different translations into that same passage. I think maybe it was Bart Ehrman that said when you read the Bible, you need to kind of take sections of like the four Gospels and go directly to each episode to compare them versus read it sequentially. It's that direct vertical reading where you see the differences and it really comes out. And thank you, John, for the pattern. And the slave was getting to the set with the fire out. But actually, that makes me think. Gosh, Heidegger had a nice reading of Plato's Cave. I think he drew like a picture or something. Maybe Johannes was talking about that. That was really good. And on that idea of the self-taught, is that best? Well, we're going to be arguing. I mean, ultimately, in this book, that intrinsic motivation and being self-taught become very necessary today to incubate in people so that they can avoid Deleuzian capture, so that we can have an economy that's not based on stimulating demand, but is able to create demand, that is able to have true diversity, that isn't simply following into macro patterns of what people think is diversity. So self-taught is a really big deal. But what's very interesting is right here, there's an acknowledgement of self-taught as a category, but it's being denied. This is important because it's saying the people in the cave who left, they were not self-taught. They were dragged out. And again, if we take the Muse interpretation, which I really like from Upcycle, and that's exactly a way we need to think it. I think there's plenty of room in Plato to think about the Muse, or D.C. Sindler talks about the beautiful as gathering us, or the good that's beyond limitation or presupposition that we can think but can't put into the words, because the moment you do, you've limited it and it's not that thing. I think there's definitely room in Plato to think about the possibility of intrinsic motivation and gathering. But the question is, do we have an educational program for it? Do we find the educational program for that in Plato? Of people finding it on their own? That's the tricky thing. How do you find the beautiful on your own? That's I think a really big question that we have to explore. And I appreciate John. We enjoy having you. And again, to pick up, I'll skip a little bit here. Plato refers to the prisoners as our pupils, Joet, page 230, suggesting the prisoners only escape thanks to educators. But this is not within the allegory itself, and we as readers can simply imagine the allegory as suggesting that the freed prisoner chooses to submit his or herself to schooling, not that schooling is entirely responsible for everything enlightened about the prisoner, including the desire to learn it all. So this is also important. I think you do see more and more evidence for the dragged interpretation outside the allegory, but very often the allegory is read or given to people without the context. And that often is a major problem. One of some of the most, I think about those existential readers that take episodes from a lot of the great texts like the Moose, the Fall, or the Grand Inquisitor, the Brothers Karamazov, and you get the Grand Inquisitor, but you don't get the rebellion section before it, which is the context of the Grand Inquisitor section. And that's really important because, in that, Ivan says quite clearly, I think it's Rebellion is the name of the chapter before the Grand Inquisitor. And Ivan says very clearly that the three temptations that Jesus is presented with are so perfect that they could have only been thought of by a divine mind. So he thinks that those temptations prove that God exists. But then he turns around and says that he's against the creation that God created. So, this way that I think is a really big deal, because what it means is that the Grand Inquisitor section of the Brothers Karamazov is not Ivan disproving the existence of God. It's Ivan saying that he is against the choice of God to give man free will. But then the critical point is that famous idea that is often attributed to Alyosha, which is that if God didn't exist, everything would be permitted. That's actually Ivan. He says a different version of it earlier in the book, 70 or something of the translation, where he says everything finite requires an infinite value. If it was not to melt, something that's not it at all, but it's something like that. Well, then what Ivan realizes is that his very critique of that God made a bad choice to give man free will requires there to be a God to feel that that was a bad choice. Well, then it makes sense why Ivan Karamazov goes nuts, right? That the insanity of Ivan makes sense, but you don't get that if you remove the context, right? And so, I mean, that's an issue I think that can happen with the allegory of the cave. if you remove it from the context, you get a very, very different a different way of doing things. And a new way of speaking, Mills, a prisoner sets up a pattern that suggests a shifting hermeneutic. I think a shifting hermeneutic is a good way to think about it. So the question becomes, what would it mean to have an education that can incubate within people a shifting hermeneutic? I think, and stuff like that, I think is beautiful. And maybe mushrooms could be too. If you could find mushrooms in the cave, John, it could help. So then toward the end of book 7, we have another of things to translate here. Therefore, calculation, geometry, and all the preliminary education required for dialectic must be offered to the future rules and childhood. And this was what I was quoting earlier. And not in the shape of compulsory learning either. No free person should learn anything like a slave. Forced bodily labor does not harm to the body, but nothing taught by force stays in the soul. And then after that in Duet we have, and therefore calculation, it's kind of similar, not however under any notion of forcing our system of education, because a free man ought not to be a slave in the acquisition of knowledge of any kind. And then the last one is similar from Bloom. So that what's interesting about this is Plato is now suggesting, this exchange suggests that children shouldn't be dragged out of the cave per se, that Fi is indeed the case. And it is easy to read this section and retrospectively interpret the allegory in terms of Fi over Di. Yes, this section can indeed be fitted into Di, for children could be forced to play, but Plato's remarkable claim here, nothing taught by force stays in the soul, flies in the face of the dragged interpretation. Perhaps Plato is saying that children shouldn't be forced to learn, but a stricter hand can be put upon adults. This is suggested most clearly in the Duet interpretation. Let early education be a sort of amusement, but it is not clear if that means only early education or early and late education. And Fi could have us assume the latter. And if force hurts education in younger children, why should we assume teenagers and adults would be any different? Plato here has given Fi strong evidence for its case, even if the quoted sections can be worked into Di. So what's very interesting is that we have here a notion that Plato understands that what you force upon children, they won't hold. They're going to lose it, right? It has to be something that they come to, and yet we have this understanding that leaving the cave is forced. So then this begs the question that if there's some kind of force that is required for leaving the cave, how do you engage in a force that doesn't destroy the intrinsic motivation that could follow? And in this, we're pointing all this out because what we're framing slowly to look ahead in the book is the problem of scale. The problem of scale, the problem of what Daniel Fraga talks about, in his great book on ontological design. How does one engage in ontological design without engaging in totalitarianism? The war of ontological design is what the problem of scale section will start with. So we have this idea that Plato understands that education requires a certain self-motivation. But then there's this question of how do you even start self-motivation then without getting into trouble? So to resume, if children shouldn't be forced to learn, Plato is suggesting a theory of intrinsic motivation that is brought out in play. And Plato is indeed suggesting that there is something intrinsically different about the released prisoner who ascends compared to the others down in the cave. Thus the emphasis on nature in the last sentence of the quoted section. This leaves us with a hanging question to which we will return. But for now, the point is that, thanks to what Plato has claimed, we can easily imagine the released prisoners are taught the truth by teachers, but thanks to a natural disposition, they ultimately motivate themselves to listen and leave the cave. I think this is another popular angle that avoids the Di, but doesn't fall into a hard Fi, which still managed to hide the hanging problem, though, of the first prisoner. We come to believe that we escaped the cave thanks to us taking our education to motivate ourselves to seek the truth. But this doesn't seem to necessarily be what happens. Or happens in everyday life or in the allegory, it just depends. The section just mentioned being an exception, and in sections after the allegory of the cave, we begin to receive a clearer and more uniformed understanding about the meaning of the cave. However, these sections are rarely included in accounts of the cave, like I was saying. The cave is pulled out of the rest of the context, which creates a different impression. Additionally, the following can still be read as saying that some prisoners escape on their own, and then that the founders teach them and eventually force them back. So to go back to the interpretation, it is our task as founders then to compel the best natures to reach the study we said before is the most important, namely to make the ascent and see the good. But when they've made it and look sufficiently, we mustn't allow them to do what they're allowed to do today, to stay there and refuse to go back again to the prisoners in the cave and share their labors and honors, rather, they are less worthy or of greater. So we can't let them stay outside the cave. They've got to go back. John, thank you for coming. Always a pleasure, sir. Always a pleasure. And so now looking at Joette, then the business of us who are the founders of the state will be to compel the best minds to attain the knowledge which we have already shown to be the greatest of all. And then in the Bloom, then our job as founders is to compel the base nations to go back into the study, and so on and so forth. Plato, who positions himself with Socrates as a founder of the Republic, who is justified to force the best in the Republic to see the truth and then force them to return into the city. Since the truth is good and wonderful, and since the best minds wouldn't have encountered the truth without Plato, Plato is then morally justified to force them to leave it behind for the greater good. The allegory favors Plato, but it begs the question, who let Plato out of the cave? So, after going through all this, we do have a question now. All right, well, who let Plato out of the cave? So we'll now move into section 1.1D. And again, I appreciate everyone being here today. So 1.1D. The allegory of the cave describes a prisoner being dragged into the light, not walking up into it according to bold and independent choice. This leaves open a glaring question. Even if most prisoners are forced out, how did the first prisoner escape? Someone must have escaped the cave on their own at some point, yes? Otherwise, no one could have come down into the cave and forced others out. So please note, we are not saying that it is impossible for someone to be inspired out of the cave, forced out of the cave, and to then become intrinsically motivated. We're not saying that. But now what we have is a certain hypothetical situation we can call as a limit case, that in considering, we might be able to think philosophical, educational, etc. problems that otherwise we would not think. So we're thinking of a kind of extreme case to see what comes of it. So the first prisoner scenario opens the door on a big question, the role of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Plato alluded to the possibility of intrinsic motivation when discussing self-growth, but he mostly set that possibility down and declared founders as justified to force philosophers back down into the cave, perhaps suggesting that Plato doesn't want to consider the existence of intrinsic motivation because that might significantly complexify his project. And please also note the whole idea of someone being forced back into the cave, there's kind of a suggestion there that those people forced down will then drag new people out or will teach the people down there, all of which would remove the need to think much harder about this problem of intrinsic motivation. But if someone is left there on their own, how else would they leave without intrinsic motivation? And where in the world does that come from? Now, to Plato's defense, I do think there are sections where he kind of suggests this big question. So starting in group, do you want us to consider how such people will come to be in our city, and how, just as some have said, to have come up from Hades to the gods, will lead them up to the light? This is Joette. And now so we consider in what way such guardians will be produced, and how they are to be brought from darkness to light, as some are said to have ascended from the world below to the gods. Then Bloom, do you want us now to consider in what way such men will come into being, and how one will lead them up to the light, just as some men are said to have gone from Hades up to the gods? So again, group here aligns best with DI, followed by Bloom and Joette, though again, I would argue none of these lines are strong enough to overturn an FI bias. After this question, Plato proceeds to simply lay out his program for education, which doesn't address the problem of the first prisoner. And again, I think the program can easily be read into FI, which avoids the first prisoner problem by making the problem seem addressed. However, if we focus on this question, we can see DI in it, and Plato is arguably clear. No one escapes the cave on their own, but in fact are escorted out by someone else, or a muse, or some internal property, but something else, something alien. Of course, though, even if we followed the DI reading in this way, the question still hangs. How did Plato escape the cave? It could be argued that the first prisoner would have had to put himself in prison, which makes no sense. People must have been born in the upper world, and for some reason, some people were forced to have children underground in the cave, where the children were forced to stay and be raised. This would solve the first prisoner problem per se, a phrase I intend to be associated with the first mover. But this solution seems very similar to the Christian Eden, where humanity was born in paradise but ended up in sin and fallen. Perhaps that is indeed what occurred, and perhaps the person who sets prisoners free is ultimately God by his grace and grace alone. The allegory could fit into a Christian metaphysics, and you'll hear some people discuss that. All right, fine, fine. That would solve the first prisoner problem, but then we simply reframe the dilemma as the prisoner nobody comes for. So this is another way we can get at the same problem, which is to ask, what happens to a trapped prisoner to whom no teacher comes down to release or explain the upper world? Is this prisoner doomed? Is there no way for the prisoner to escape, either because the chains are too tight to break and or because motivation to escape never arises? Plato might think that way, but what about us? The prisoner nobody comes for is a critical thought experiment, and though it's not what happens in Plato's allegory, it is still logically a very fair scenario to consider, one that I think brings into focus the extreme importance of intrinsic motivation, a topic stressed throughout O.G. Rose, which leads us into the question of if it's possible to cultivate aesthetic and intrinsic capacities. The prisoner nobody comes for is the hanging question we are left with from Plato's famous allegory, a hanging question that American mythology around the allegory seems to help us forget and avoid. Remembering the text as we please, we can imagine that we just do escape the cave on our own, that we don't need any help from anyone. But if we take seriously that we cannot free ourselves without some kind of nudge, then the question cannot be avoided. How can we nudge ourselves? The answer doesn't seem like it can be entirely reduced to ourselves, but it also doesn't seem like it can be entirely explained communally. Neither hard individualism nor hard belief in external forces will do. Well, what will? This book will explore that question. Is it possible for us to enable people to leave Plato's cave on their own without force? Say, to incubate a muse or incubate inspiration or incubate a will, etc., so forth. This will be for us to ask if we can spread the conditions of Nietzschean childhood to the majority, as was discussed in Belonging Again, Part 1, which is ultimately the question of if the majority might overcome discourse in favor of rhetoric, as too will have to be explained. Perhaps discourse has trained us to overlook the question to help solidify its power, and we'll explain what discourse is later in the book. And that's going to also get us into Kafka and a conversation I had with II.1. And so what do I refer to all this? Why do I refer to all this as a hanging question in Plato? For Plato, how the prisoner escapes the cave isn't hanging at all. The prisoner is forced out by an instructor. Yes, but we are logically permitted to wonder, how did that instructor escape? If we are meant to understand the allegory as the movement from being uneducated to being educated, or from being ignorant to being enlightened, then the allegory describes a process everyone must go through, and that would include the instructor, and his instructor, and his instructor, on and on. The allegory of the cave presents us with a first mover problem, for eventually we must work our way back to a version of the cave involving the first man, in which nobody comes down to free or force out a prisoner. Regarding this first man, the question is fair. How does he escape? The first prisoner problem, or the prisoner nobody came for problem, which are practically identical here, are not found in the Republic, but they together are logically a version of the allegory we need to consider. It applies practically just as well to anyone who lacks a teacher, who exists in a world where the quality of education has collapsed, and who doesn't have access to anyone who can help them achieve the love of wisdom. I think there are lots of people like this, and perhaps the widespread understanding of the cave, devoid of force and dragging, is evidence that this is the case. The world is perhaps full of people who must somehow intrinsically motivate themselves to leave the cave. Can they rise to the occasion? How? Can intrinsic motivation be taught at scale? And if not, if not, can we give it to ourselves? The confusing bothness of Plato's cave, where it simultaneously suggests FI and DI, attention we have perhaps wanted so that we could lean toward FI freely, has perhaps been a tension which has strongly shaped Western society. And following Hegel, perhaps consciousness is now reaching a new stage of possible self-understanding in light of that tension. Plato presents us with a tension between the individual and society, where if the prisoner frees his or herself, the society seems unjustified to control that prisoner. But if the prisoner is only freed thanks to the society has a greater claim on the prisoner, which is the case. Well, the debate rages on, and so the West emerges. Now, though, we are perhaps entering a new phase of Western development, a phase deeply connected to the fate of beauty and location of the apathetic. If so, then indeed much comes down to the nature of intrinsic motivation. Plato may address the problem of intrinsic motivation, where motivation somewhere else in his corpus that I don't know about, and it again becomes clearer that the DI plays a role the more we read Plato's allegory. But that all said, I hope this exploration has clarified how the FI perhaps grew, developed, and spread, and why the DI has been forgotten and muddled. Furthermore, I hope the case has been made for why the topic of intrinsic motivation deserves attention and unpacking, If it's impossible for us to incubate, the state is easily just to force us as it sees best for realizing the good. Is this what Plato wanted? Did he ignore the question of intrinsic motivation and fear that it might undermine the claims of the state over the individuals? I don't know, but the stakes are high in determining the role and possibility of intrinsic motivation. If there is no hope of us achieving it, then what wrong can the state commit to compel us for what's best? What does all this mean? It suggests there is an overlooked question lurking at the heart of the Republic, arguably at its very foundation, one that hasn't been adequately addressed, that we have paradoxically avoided addressing by remembering it as addressed, as perhaps aided by the zeitgeist. This has helped create the impression that the West is taking care of the problem and already does incubate people to leave the cave on their own, when not even Plato describes this occurring. We misremember and so remember ourselves above Plato, perhaps. What we end up with in the West, hence, is an odd, ambiguous mixture of believing people freely make themselves, while at the same time needing to be taught, which is to say we in the West tend to believe that we need teachers, but at the same time are somehow rugged individuals. To some degree, this might be true, but this ambiguous mixture is what we, at best, can project back onto the allegory of the cave, or alternatively, we remember the allegory as entirely a narrative of freely leaving the cave on our own, creating the impression that such is even possible, and that we likely happen to be one of those people who autonomously leave, suggesting it is all right to autonomously think. And indeed, it does seem to be the case that some random people can leave Plato's cave on their own, and perhaps for most of history it was fine for us to interpret this foundational Western myth as either an ambiguous mixture of guidance plus free choice, or as a myth entirely about free choice, for overlooking an unresolved question of the allegory. How would anyone leave on their own? Was not so consequential, and perhaps Hegelian, the error even had a historic function. But, as we will argue in Belonging Again Part 2, it seems that we can no longer afford overlooking or misinterpreting the allegory in a way that contributes to us failing to see a problem we have yet adequately addressed. For now, we need to be intentional about intrinsic motivation and drive, which is a psychoanalytical term. We must face the reality that the allegory is a story of being dragged out of the cave, which means Plato does not give us a narrative of how we might leave the cave on our own. By extension, we need to see an unanswered question in Plato, even if in other ways Plato provides resources to help address that very question, that we can then turn, look over our world and see if that question is answered there, or to see we have been avoiding it, innocently or not, perhaps to help ourselves imagine it was answered. To be hopeful, though, considering the problem of the undragged prisoner, might help us think through socioeconomics, politics, and the like differently than today can seem exhausted. That today can seem exhausted in their possibilities. Belonging Again, Part 1 left us with a glaring problem on how the majority might be Deleuzian, absolute knowers, and/or Nietzschean children, and Plato might offer us a blueprint in the Republic, but one that is oppressive and forceful. It requires dragging, as do all or most of the sociological options today. As this book will explain, our investigation is if we might inspire the majority to be children without being dragged, which ultimately will force us to investigate the conditions which incubate or realize intrinsic motivation, a problem that misunderstanding the allegory has helped us avoid while thinking there was nothing missed. Here, the allegory of the cave is used to help frame our investigation. And please note that to ask, how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own, is to metaphorically ask if there is theoretically a situation possible that people could end up in and have no hope of escaping. Because if this could occur, then it's possible to be captured and have no hope of escaping that capture. So it's a serious hypothetical. If we could address this problem, though, then there could theoretically always be hope, even if that hope was unlikely. There must never be a game over until the game was indeed, there might never be a game over until the game was indeed over. In pursuit of that thread, suggesting no cave must be our final resting place, we will next connect Plato with Nietzsche. So that will bring us to an end of 1.1, A through D, which was part of the chapter, How Does Anyone Leave Plato's Cave on Their Own? Next, we will discuss 1.2, which is Plato, Nietzsche, and Beastocentrism. For anyone interested in that, there's a presentation at Philosophy Portal with the Thus Spoke Zarathustra conference. And again, the Philosophy of Right will be starting soon on the 18th of May. Be sure to sign up today. And for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com. And thanks everyone for being here today. I appreciate it. And John, good to see you. Mills, everyone, Upcycle, really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much. All the best, everyone. All the best. All the best.